we're going to have to be vigilant on two different fronts. We're going to have to defend the truth about the human person, made in the image and likeness of God, created male and female, created for marriage. We're also going to have to defend our freedom to live according to those truths.
Dr. Ryan Anderson, president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and member of the White House Religious Liberty Commission, speaking at this year's Issues, Etc. Making the Case conference.
Over and over again, we're going to see that we have to form the next generation of our students, of our children, our grandchildren to believe the truth, while also defending our freedom to live it out. And then the long game is reforming our civil laws to reflect the truth.
You can watch Ryan Anderson's presentation, Making the Case for Social Conservatism, from the 2026 Issues, Etc. Making the Case conference. For a donation of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to watch an on-demand video stream and download audio recordings. Order online at issuesetc.org.
I think the fate of Christianity in Europe should be very, very sobering for Christians in America and make them realize that nothing can be taken for granted at this point.
What you actually can affirm for your child is you are baptized. You don't need to be defined by this gender dysphoria that's nagging at you and trying to get you to carve up your body and make all these changes. You are actually defined by what God says.
Union with the flesh of Jesus. There is nothing greater than that. And American evangelicalism cannot say that. It's a disembodied Christ. There's no Jesus in the water, Jesus in the Word, Jesus in your ear, Jesus in your mouth.
All of the Lutherans from the very beginning to the very end teach not only that good works are to be done, but even the necessity of good works.
Grocery clerks in Tennessee love listening to Issues, Etc.
When the framers of the greatest republic in human history, the United States of America, were putting their Constitution down on paper, they were doing so with one eye on the other great republic in human history, and that is the Roman Republic. They marked its rise, how it was constituted, how it was maintained, and then how it collapsed, and they learned their lessons. Welcome back to Issues, Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Thanks for tuning us in. It's time for part two of our series on the fall of the great republics. Dr. Thomas Madden joins us. He's professor of history at St. Louis University, author of the new book, The Fall of the Republics, a history from ancient Carthage to the American Constitution. Dr. Madden, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
We've talked a lot about the Roman Republic, but we're going to focus on it in this part of our conversation. And you say that in many ways, as a republic, this greatest of historic republics is unique. How so?
Yes, it is. It's not unique in its organization or in the way that it came about. It came about, organically. And the components of the republic, of three different competing sections within that republic, the rule by one, rule by few, rule by many, so the democracy, aristocracy, executive, or monarchy components were all in there, similar to previous republics. But what made it unique was that every other republic before dealt with a very dangerous world. In fact, all governments dealt with dangerous worlds. They were formed to protect against other people who wish you ill. And they protect their people and they protect their lands. And the Roman Republic reached a point in the 2nd century BC where they had, in essence, defeated all of the external enemies. And so they were the first republic that no longer had something to fear from outside. There were still, of course, people who wished Rome ill out there, but none of them could actually harm the Republic of Rome. None of them were an existential danger to Rome. So Rome reached a level, because of its expanding empire, that no republic had before. And I argue why that was a problem is that the Republic, because of it has within it a competition between interests, not only the checks and balances of the various elements in the Republic, but also the different constituencies within a republic who are competing against each other. That benefits republics. It preserves the independence and the liberty of the people, and it ensures that the best ideas generally percolate to the top. But in this case, with once the external enemies had been removed, once that fear of an external enemy was removed, and once the entire Western world in the Mediterranean realized that Rome was preeminent in its power and wealth, then all of that went away. And the Republic, therefore, found itself in a position where it was the arena of real power in the Western world, whether this was within Rome's control or not. Everyone knew that they would have to play Rome's game. And so rather than the battlefields becoming the place where things were decided, the Roman Forum became that. And it meant that the forces within the Roman Republic began to kind of supercharge, and the fights between various constituencies within the Roman Republic became extremely fierce. And this built on itself. As each year went by, as we go into the end of the 2nd century BC, the fights become fiercer and fiercer. The political parties divide rapidly, and the common concept that they were all working together for a common aim drifted apart, and everything became simply, what can I get out of this for myself? One of the great Roman writers, Sallust, in fact, says this very clearly. He says that when we had enemies, the fear of those enemies made certain that all of us worked together. But now that those enemies are gone and wealth pours into Rome, every man is for himself. Every party is for themselves. And there is no longer any concern for the greater good of the state. And that's what begins to erode the Roman Republic. So Rome had to deal with something that no republic before ever had to deal with. And ultimately, it tore apart the fabric of the republic.
Just to pause for a moment in the history of this thing, is there a parallel / lesson for the American Republic in that respect?
I think so. I argue in the book that for Rome, the really important date is 146 BC, which is the fall of Carthage, which had always been their nemesis. And I argue that you could choose a date around, say, 1989 or 1990, when the Soviet Union is collapsing, that would fit that same type of thing. This existential threat to the United States disappears. And then almost immediately after that, in both cases, almost immediately after that, you begin to see hyperpartisanship. So within 13 years of the fall of Carthage, you have Tiberius Gracchus, who is supercharging, really creating the two-party system that is going to start to tear apart the republic. Same in the United States, you have very, very quickly after the fall of the Soviet Union, say under President Clinton, you have what he called the politics of personal destruction. And you have now increasing divide between the political parties, and the amount of compromise becomes less and less as time goes on. Now, I want to stress, and as I do in the book, that the United States has not reached anything close to the kind of strife and chaos that Rome did. But the reason for that is that the founders, the framers of the American Constitution, were all looking at Rome. The education of these men was based on the classics. And they had read Livy and Sallust and Polybius And so they had a good idea about the types of things which had brought down the Roman Republic. And as they put together the American Constitution, they were very mindful of those things and wanted to ensure that they put checks into the system so that the American experiment would not end up going the same direction. Now, of course, they did not imagine that their creation, the United States, would reach some level at which there were no existential threats any longer. But they did still want to make sure that the components that they saw in Roman history that led to the fall of the Republic did not end their new experiment. And I think those safeguards, which I go through in the book, I think those have held fairly well.
Returning to ancient Rome, what does that tell us about republics in general, that if they manage to reach this apotheosis, it itself can bring about their fall?
I mean, among systems of government, the mixed government republic is certainly the best form. It's the one that has the chance for lasting the longest, much more so than a simple form of government, just a simple monarchy, for example. It can last for a very long time while preserving the liberty of the people. In general, though, it is exceedingly rare in human history for any one power to reach a preeminence in which it no longer fears external enemies any longer. So it's a good problem to have, I suppose, to reach that level, but it is corrosive to the Republic. And simply because it takes off what I call the cooling mechanism. The fear of external enemies creates a cooling mechanism, which means that those members of the Republic who would naturally oppose each other cannot oppose each other with abandon because they both have a shared interest in preserving the state. You can kind of see this, I think, in a microcosm if you look at, again, in the American case, if you look at when it's suspended. So if you remember in 2000, in the presidential election in 2000, it was very fiercely fought between the Vice President Al Gore and George W. Bush. And it came down to an electoral college victory for Bush only after a long period of going through ballots in Florida. So when he was inaugurated, the country was very, very divided. And in fact, there were many Democrats who said they would never accept him as president. But then 9/11 happened, and overnight, everything changed. Suddenly, everyone was on the same team. There was an enormous amount of patriotism. Americans genuinely tried to find a way to help. George Bush went to Yankee Stadium and threw out the first pitch, and everyone in the stands, most of which voted against him, stood up with tears coming down their face because this fear of an external enemy had brought everyone together, and it caused and as long as that fear lasted, that unity continued. Once that fear subsided, then of course you went back to this hyper-partisanship.
Dr. Thomas Madden is our guest. It's part 2 of our series on the fall of the great republics. We'll talk about the founding of the Roman Republic next.
Here's an easy way for you to help us contend for truth in an age of anti-truth. Subscribe to the Issues Etc. podcast with YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. Just type Issues Etc. in the YouTube search engine and click subscribe. For Apple and Spotify, type Issues Etc. in the search engine, hit follow, and leave us a 5-star review. Help us inform other podcast listeners by subscribing to the Issues Etc. podcast with YouTube, Spotify, and Apple.
This fallen creation is bested by tornado, hurricane, flood, pandemic, and more. LCMS Disaster Response helps our congregations, their pastors, and other church workers to reach out to their members and neighbors with mercy which flows from Christ to altar. We offer quality volunteer training, help for congregational readiness and response, and disaster grant funding. To learn more, visit lcms.org/disaster. That's lcms.org/disaster.
Smartest listeners in podcasting. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
Looking for high-quality church music settings? Look no further than Concordia Publishing House. We have award-winning settings for handbell, organ, piano, and choral groups, featuring a wide variety of options for the entire church year. Visit cph.org/music to find a great setting today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your service.
Our church loves and is grateful for those that serve our country. Operation Barnabas, part of Ministry to the Armed Forces, equips you to reach out to veterans in your community to bring Christ to those that served. Call Ministry to the Armed Forces at 314-996-1337 or email lcmschaps@lcms.org.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you.
God bless our military.
Welcome back to Issues, Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. Dr. Thomas Madden is our guest. He's professor of history at St. Louis University, author of the new book, The Fall of the Republics, A History from Ancient Carthage to the American Constitution. Dr. Madden, take us back to the founding of the Roman Republic. What do we need to know about it?
The original founding of Rome is traditionally in the 8th century BC with Romulus and Remus. But the founding of the Roman Republic the traditional date is 509. And that's when the last of the kings of Rome was overthrown. This was Tarquinius Superbus. And when he was overthrown, the Senate, which was, as the name suggests, senatus, it means elders, a council of elders. And the council of elders became the continuation of the government. And the elders were made up of elites, obviously, what were called patricians. And they were in a political struggle with the lower classes, the plebeians. This political struggle would continue for quite a while, but out of it would come the creation of these various bodies within the Roman Republic. And as a result, certainly by 400 or 350 BC, all the basic elements of the Roman Republic had come about. So there was no lawgiver. In the case of Rome, there was no framer of a constitution. They did not have a written constitution. It came about organically. And as it came about, the Senate remained there, but also they created the popular assemblies. There were several different popular assemblies based on whether you were talking about laws that would have to do with domestic issues or law or deciding policy with regards to foreign policy or military affairs. But these assemblies allowed the people to vote and legislate. The Senate acted as a deliberative body, which would examine everything and then use its wisdom to give advice on the government. And then the executive would be annually elected magistrates at various levels. And so it came about over time and through struggle, but ultimately they created a very stable republic that would last for centuries.
When it finally does come together, it is not a constitutional republic. It has no constitution.
Well, it has a constitution, but it doesn't have a written constitution. And that's actually the norm in history. The Romans knew about written constitutions. In fact, oftentimes their own colonies that they would create elsewhere, they would write constitutions for them as to how those colonies were to govern themselves. But the republics before Rome, Carthage and Sparta, as far as we know, they did not have any written constitution. Rather, the constitution is what the Romans referred to as the mos maiorum, which meant the way of our ancestors or precedent, the way that we've always done things. And that was the norm for republics. The idea was that no written document could ever be responsive to everything that would happen to a republic. And so there needed to be some wiggle room. There needed to be some flexibility to deal with various problems as they came up. And so the Romans were very conservative. They put enormous stock into tradition, but they also were willing to tweak things when that was necessary. And so that essentially created what would be called the Constitution of Rome, but it's just the way things have always been. It's the same still today. England, which created a constitutional government, a republic, after the Glorious Revolution of 1688, they never created a written constitution and still don't have a written constitution. Rather, the Constitution is simply the sum total of the laws and the precedent that has gone before. The United States was the first of these republics to actually write it down on paper. People had talked about doing it before, certainly, but no one had actually sat down and done it, at least not on this level. Initially, after the United States came into being, after it won independence, you had the Articles of Confederation, which were not a republic at all. It was just simply a body that would come together, a Congress that would come together simply to work with these independent states. So it would deal with issues regarding trade or combined military defense, but it otherwise was not a governing body. So in the States, they were busy writing constitutions. Those constitutions, for the most part, all failed. But when the framers came together in 1787 to create the new American Constitution, they knew that they were doing something that was new. And that's why it gave them a certain amount of comfort to look back to ancient Rome, because they could see there how it could work well. And they could also see there what were the problems that ultimately led to its decline.
As an aside here, what are the advantages in a republic for a written constitution and disadvantages?
The main advantage is that you can read it right there. You can see it written on paper. The disadvantage is that, of course, like all written things, it has to be interpreted. And the argument against the written constitution was that the interpreters, in our case, the judiciary, the interpreters will end up taking over. They'll end up having inordinate amount of power because they'll be able to strike down laws that the people have otherwise legislated based on the written document. That's the argument against it. The argument for it, of course, is that it does have to be interpreted, but it means that it is much less malleable. So if it's necessary, or even not necessary, but there's just a great desire to make fundamental changes to it, because it's written, it can't be done unless there's an enormous desire among the people to make those changes. Now, there are many amendments to the U.S. Constitution, but it takes a great deal of agreement to get an amendment, and it's designed to be difficult to do. So it forms a much more solid foundation to have it written down. There's no way to get around it because it's written right there.
Dr. Thomas Madden is our guest. It's part 2 of our series on the fall of the great republics. We'll discuss the Roman Senate next.
It's also a confirmation of what the church has proclaimed for millennia, that we are not made to be alone, but we are made for covenant.
Sociologist Dr. Brad Wilcox speaking at this year's Issues Etc. Making the Case conference.
So give today's young men and women the truth that they deserve. Pursue marriage, pursue it with intention, and pursue it in your 20s when the window is widest and the possibilities most open. The road ahead, of course, is not easy, but it leads somewhere worth going, and you, 20-somethings here, were made for this journey.
You can watch and listen to Dr. Brad Wilcox making the case for 20-something marriage from the 2026 Making the Case conference. For a $250 gift by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to video and audio recordings of the entire conference. Learn more at issuesetc.org.
We love our on-demand listeners. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
Lutherans for Life assists for-life Christians in offering the hope and help of the good news of Jesus Christ to women with an untimely pregnancy, women, men, and families suffering under the guilt of an abortion, young people with questions and concerns about sexuality, and the elderly and those with disabilities or terminal illnesses. Learn more about LFL resources and forming a life team or life chapter, or becoming a life advocate by calling 888-364-LIFE. That is 888-364-5433, or by visiting lutheransforlife.org.
Concordia University Chicago invites all high school students to attend the annual Careers for Christ weekend in person on our beautiful campus in River Forest. Careers for Christ is October 10th through the 12th. You'll have the opportunity to learn about professional church vocations while having fun with CUC staff, faculty, and students. For more information, visit cuchicago.edu/C4C. That is cuchicago.edu/C4C.
Well, the vocation of pastor, I would say, is a vocation that will bring you the greatest joy ever. That the Lord would use you to speak forth words of eternal life to His people, that He would use your mouth and your hands to deliver these gifts to His people.
Dr. Carl Beckwith, professor of historical theology at Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana.
I think, in my mind, there's no better place to be than Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and all should rejoice in the opportunity to come here to study for the ministry.
Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana, forms servants in Jesus Christ who teach the faithful, reach the lost, and care for all. For information on studying for the vocation of pastor, visit ctsfw.edu or call 1-800-481-2155. Concordia Theological Seminary, Fort Wayne, Indiana. Thanks to Kent in Seattle, Don in Idaho, and Jim in Michigan for recently ordering recordings of the 2026 Issues Etc. Making the Case conference. For a contribution of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to watch a video stream and to download audio recordings of the entire conference. This year's speakers included Molly Hemingway, Russell Dawn, Ryan Anderson, Megan Basham, Brad Wilcox, Matt Harrison, Will Whedon, and Brian Wolfmiller. You can order online at issuesetc.org or by giving us a call, 618-223-8385. It's part 2 of our series on the fall of the Great Republics with Dr. Thomas Madden. Dr. Madden, how would you describe the Roman Senate, especially to those of us for whom Senate means the upper house of divided government?
I mean, it was that, but the difference in the Roman case was that the Senate was not elected, not directly anyway, and it was also not a legislative body. It did not create legislation, and its vote did not create the law the way that the U.S. Senate does. So it was purely a deliberative body. Now, the way you became a senator, there were, depending on what period we're talking about, but in the earlier period, there were certain patrician families that were just afforded certain seats in the Senate. Later in the Republican history, that was no longer the case. But there were some people who just got into the Senate simply because of their family. And a Senate seat was given to you not for a set term, but it was for life. So you could serve in that body for the rest of your life. Now, there would be regular, usually every 10 years, there would be examinations of all of the people in the Senate done by the censors. And if someone had committed crimes or in some other way had brought dishonor to Rome, they could be removed from the Senate. But otherwise, as long as you did things right, you would stay in for the rest of your life. The other way, and the most common way that you would become a senator, is you were an ex-magistrate, what's known as an ex-cural magistrate. So the highest magistrate offices, the consul, the praetor, those very high offices, after you were elected to them and had served your term, then you would become a member of the Senate for the rest of your life. The idea was that these were the best and the brightest men in Rome. None of them could have gotten to those positions unless they had had already a career in politics, but also in the military. And so bringing them all together, this was kind of the pool of wisdom. The Romans themselves put enormous amounts of trust in the Senate. And in the Republican system, because of that trust, whenever legislation was proposed in the popular assemblies, that legislation would always be sent to the Senate first to get the Senate's approval of it. The idea was to find out whether this is a good idea or not. And the Senate would then debate the legislation. It's the only place legislation would be debated. And then they would issue advice, senatus consultum, which would be essentially their view on this legislation. And because there was so much respect for that, that weighed heavily on the popular assemblies. Generally, if the Senate said no, then it was a non-starter. It wouldn't go forward. If the Senate said yes, then it would go forward. So although it did not legally have the ability to legislate, in practice, it was the sine qua non for that legislation. Now, one of the problems that came about later on, as the first cracks in the Republic began to demonstrate themselves, was when this system became short-circuited. Once the fighting between the political parties became very fierce, first manifested under Tiberius Gracchus in 133, when Tiberius wanted to put forth a land bill. It was essentially a redistribution of land wealth, of government property that was currently under control of a number of wealthy people. He wanted to confiscate the land and redistribute it to the poor. He knew that the Senate, because many of them were the men who owned those properties, would not be in favor of it. And so what he did was he just end-runned the Senate. He brought the legislation to the assembly without going to the Senate at all. And initially, one of the other tribunes, Tiberius was a tribune, one of the other tribunes vetoed it. But ultimately, Tiberius had that tribune ejected and then forced the vote in the popular assemblies without this going to the Senate. Ultimately, the Senate did consider it and they rejected it. So what Tiberius had done was he used the fact that the Senate was only offering advice and simply said, well, we can't trust the Senate to give us advice on this, so we're just going to move ahead without the Senate. And this worried the Senate and others too, because it looked to them like Tiberius was attempting to become a king. He seemed to be stoking populism among the lower classes, among the plebeians, to get to a position higher and higher. And in fact, he wanted to be reelected as tribune, which was not allowed in the Roman constitution. And so it looked very clearly like he was breaking the norms of the constitution in order to bring more and more power to himself. And one thing that in the ancient world people understood well, and the framers of the Constitution understood well, was that the source of all tyranny is always the people. As soon as the people are able to exercise power without constraint from an aristocratic body or from an executive body, when they are completely unrestrained, they will immediately gravitate towards a demagogue. And that demagogue will ultimately become a tyrant. And so for the Romans, they looked at, and particularly in the Senate, they looked at Tiberius as somebody who wanted to become king. And the Romans hated the idea of kings. They had overthrown the kings before, and they did not want another king. And so that's what led ultimately in 133 to the senators essentially going into the assembly while Tiberius was there and ultimately killing him, claiming that they were saving the republic. And that once violence became part of the political process, that was a major blow to the republic. And it wouldn't be the last time that violence would be used.
Talk about these non-senatorial offices, the magistrates, especially one you've mentioned here already, and that would be the consul.
Yeah, the consul was the highest of the offices. Normally you would become a consul you would work your way up these various offices. So if you were a young man, you would first do your military service, and then you would begin to work your way up the various magistrate offices. And the highest office was the consul. There were 2 of them elected every year. The consul had the authority, what was known as imperium, but it had the authority to command troops. Now, in the early days of the Republic, you would have the 2 consuls, and one would be given one legion, and one would be given the other legion. And one might go off someplace and fight a campaign, and the other one would generally stay closer to home to defend Rome against any possible attacks. But as Rome's footprint grew, and as it extended its power further and further away, the consuls there were far more legions than they could command themselves. So these consuls would have people who would command troops for them, which were known as proconsuls. They would use the authority of the consul given to them, delegated to them, so that they could command troops in the field. This was also important because as the Roman Empire continued to grow, a consul only served for 1 year. So if you were elected and you were to take over in January, you would barely get to your legion if it was in Asia, and then be able to do a few things before your term would expire. So the proconsuls allowed for these generals to spend more time in the field. The consuls, and this was true for all of the magistrates, each consul could veto the actions of the other consul and could veto the actions of all magistrates that were lower than them on that roster. So there was an enormous amount of vetoes in the system. And in fact, veto is a Latin word. It just means I forbid. So the idea was that nothing would move forward unless everyone agreed to it. The consuls were curule, so they also sat in the Senate. And of course, as an ex-consul, once their term expired, they would be in the highest levels of the Senate because they had reached the highest magistrate office.
We will discuss where the emperors entered the picture in the Roman Republic or its decline with Dr. Thomas Madden next.
The church's music from the 2nd century.
Shepherd of tender youth, guiding in love and truth.
The 6th century. The 12th century. The 16th century. The 21st century. The best of the church's music from the past 2,000 years. LutheranPublicRadio.org.
Education and edification. You're listening to Issues, Etc.
For nearly 140 years, the Lutheran Witness has taught the faith, defended it against error, and shown forth the great treasures of the Lutheran Church and biblical doctrine. We're continuing this legacy by publishing issues and articles that help you see the world from a Lutheran perspective and that teach biblical doctrine and show forth the treasures of God's Word. Visit our website to learn more and how to subscribe, witness.lcms.org. The Lutheran Witness, helping you interpret the world from a Lutheran perspective.
Birds sing, cows moo, thunderstorms wake you from a deep sleep, but for many, they can't hear it. They're deaf, living in a world of total silence. The Epitha Lutheran Mission Society for Deaf Ministry is the only recognized service organization in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod devoted exclusively to the deaf and hard of hearing. Their mission is to bring the gospel message of Jesus' love and saving grace to those who are deaf. Learn more at elms-deaf.org.
Welcome back. I'm Todd Wilkin. Dr. Thomas Madden is our guest. It's part 2 of our series on the fall of the great republics. We were talking about the Senate and the magistrates. When did the emperors enter the picture?
The emperor is essentially the symptom of the death of the republic. The English word emperor comes from the Roman imperator, which really just means general, the person who wields imperium. And so it didn't have that connotation. But as the Roman Republic continues to break apart into factional fighting, ultimately into civil wars between various, essentially politicians with armies who are fighting against each other, as that continues on, it caused an enormous amount of disruption, particularly in the civil wars, say between Pompey and Caesar, or in the civil wars between Octavian and Mark Antony. This caused an enormous amount of disruption, and Romans wanted it to stop. So by the time you get into the 40s BC, the Roman Republican system is clearly broken, and Romans are increasingly desirous of anything or anyone who will just bring order to the system. And so when a civil war breaks out between Mark Antony and Octavian, it ultimately is decided in 31 at the Battle of Actium when Octavian defeats Mark Antony. And when Octavian returns to Rome, he has, through his own personal power and his own personal wealth, he has complete control over all of the armed forces of Rome, and in essence, personal control over the entire Roman Republic. Octavian, who would later receive the name Augustus, is the first Roman emperor. But he knew that Romans hated the idea of kings, and they loved the idea of the republic. It's just that it didn't work anymore. So unlike Julius Caesar, who had reached that same pinnacle himself by 45 BC. Unlike Julius Caesar, who had his own golden chair in the Senate and who was frequently people calling for him to be a king, Octavian didn't do any of that. He knew that he had all the power, but he personally really loved the Roman Republic. And he figured the best way to do this was to simply cover it all up with lots of Republican window dressing. So he had no special seat. He would sit with the rest of the senators in the Senate. People could say whatever they wanted about him. If you just looked at him, you would barely know that he was the one that was really in charge. He put a lot of resources into doing traditional Roman values. He put through legislation to increase the Roman family, to put more focus on family life and on having more children. The Romans, because of their affluence, were not producing many children anymore. And he did lots of projects to talk about how he had now brought great prosperity to Rome. So he closed the great doors of the Temple of Janus, which were only closed during peacetime. And most people had never seen the doors closed. So he had a major celebration in which they closed the doors. Same thing with the Areopagus, the altar of peace, in which this altar, beautifully decorated, you can still see it in Rome today, with pictures of him and his family and all the rest worshiping the gods in the traditional way. And he did all of this while still really being the one in charge. And so he's the first of the Roman emperors, but he did it in a way that made it very palatable, even to the senators and to the others. In fact, life became better for them because they weren't worried about being assassinated or ending up on a proscription list any longer. And he also had the benefit of living a long time. Augustus died in 14 AD. So by the time he died, whole generations had been born and grown up and never known the bad old days of those civil wars. And so there was no real desire to go back to the Republican form of government. Instead, the way forward would be essentially an autocracy, a monarchy of emperors who had complete power over the whole system. Even still, although the Republic was gone, as far as the life of Romans, they would continue to live very good lives. I mean, the golden age of Rome was really under the emperors in the 1st and 2nd century AD. So the great prosperity of Rome was still growing under those emperors.
How does it come to an end? How does this great, really almost millennia-long republic, sometimes towards the end, in name only, how does it finally come to an end?
Do you mean the Roman Empire comes to an end?
As distinguished from the Republic, I suppose. Sounds like by the time of the Caesars, it is a republic in name only.
That's right. I would say that the real date for the fall of the Roman Republic is 27 BC. That's what's known as the restoration of the Republic. And that's when Octavian is back in Rome. He's defeated Mark Antony, and he gives back to the Senate and to the people all of the extraordinary powers that he's been given. And he says, I'm restoring the Republic. And the Senate says, oh, well, we couldn't take those powers back. There was really no way for him to not have that power. His power, particularly over the military, was based on who he was. Whether he had legal authority to command the troops was irrelevant. They would do whatever he asked them to do. So the power was all within his hands. So the whole idea of him not having that power was absurd. So the restoration of the Republic that's the usual date that historians would say that's the end of the Republic. At that point, the Senate insists that he hold on to certain powers, that he continue to govern certain areas of the empire. And so at that point, it's clear that his family, in a dynastic rule, is going to continue to rule Rome after this. And this is when the coins of Rome start to have the image of the emperor on them. So with Augustus, and then after his death, Tiberius, who was his stepson, and then on through these Julio-Claudian emperors in that first period of the first dynasty under Rome, all of them are going to have complete control over the system. So that by 27 BC, the Roman Republic is completely gone. And there'll still be a Senate. They will still continue to meet and debate things, and lots of smaller matters will be dealt with there. And in the various popular assemblies, there'll continue to be magistrates elected every year. But all of that exists under the autocracy of the emperors. And so it's whatever the emperors want that's going to happen.
What lessons did the American founders see in the fall of the Roman Republic?
There were several of them. The things that they were most worried about were the tyranny of the executive and the tyranny of the people. So in the tyranny of the executive, what they were worried about there was someone who had control over the military, using the military against the government to seize power. And here they were looking at like Sulla in ancient Rome. Sulla was the first of the consuls who, because his political enemies were trying to get him, he appealed to his troops and then marched on Rome, and then literally took Rome with his legions, and then executed his political opponents, and then went on to go campaign in the East. So they looked at someone like Sulla or Caesar, who they saw as somebody who came up from the people, as someone who was able to seize power, but ultimately would use the military. So they debated a lot about the president's control over the military and whether and how that should be wielded. So they were very worried about a president who could use the American military against the Republican government. And they came up with various ideas. One idea was to not have one president, have a committee of, say, 2 or 3. 2 would, of course, be the Roman example, and each one of those presidents could veto the other. But this was rejected because the idea was that a committee of presidents would not be accountable to the people because they could all point fingers at each other for whatever happened. So instead, they said, what you need to do is have one president. That way, everyone knows who's to blame for whatever ends up happening. They also took the power to declare war and put that into Congress so that it would have to be decided there. But they did specifically keep the authority of the president to, as they said, make war under the authority of the president. And in the Roman case, you had the office of dictator. And this was an extraordinary office that would only be elected in cases of emergency. And the founders of the United States, they were deeply suspicious of dictators. Caesar when he had taken power, he had taken the power of a dictator for life. And so they didn't want to create, even if it was an extraordinary office, they didn't want to create that. But they realized that you still needed a means by which the executive could respond to emergencies with the military. And so that's why they separated out the two concepts of declaring war and making war. And they gave the president that authority as commander-in-chief to make war. They put in other things as well with regards to that. Most people don't really notice it anymore, but in the Constitution, it does say that the army cannot be funded for more than 2 years at a time. The idea being that if a rogue president took the army and waged war against the Republic, at least after 2 years, the funding would run out and he wouldn't be able to presumably do that anymore. But, they're writing in a time when it's not a given that a state will have a standing army. And in fact, they make no decision about that themselves. They just simply say how that army would be funded.
Dr. Thomas Madden is professor of history at St. Louis University. He's author of the new book, The Fall of the Republics, A History from Ancient Carthage to the American Constitution. You'll find a link to this book on the podcast page for this episode at issuesetc.org. And next time, we'll talk about the Republic thread in the Middle Ages. Dr. Madden, thank you.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Thursday on Issues Etc., we'll discuss understanding burnout with Christian counselor Cassie Belts. We'll examine Jesus' claims about himself with Christian apologist Dr. Doug Groothuis and its media coverage of religion with journalist Terry Mattingly. I'm Todd Wilkin. Thanks for listening.
Listen weekday afternoons to Pastor Todd Wilkin and guests on Issues Etc. Issues Etc. is a listener-supported program. Your financial support is vital for the continuation and expansion of this worldwide outreach. Our mailing address, Issues Etc., P.O. Box 83, Collinsville, Illinois, 62234. Box 83, Collinsville, Illinois, 62234. You can also donate at our website, issuesetc.org. Issues Etc. is a production of LPR, Lutheran Public Radio.
Criticism.
Thank God that it's 5:01 and the show is over.
Commendation.
I am not a Lutheran, but I regularly listen to Issues, etc., and thank you for putting this on the air.
Conundrum.
A Catholic friend has come to our LCMS church, and he said, "Why do you say very God, a very God?" And I couldn't think of a good answer.
The Issues Etc. comment line, 618-223-8382.
This is Dr. John Bombaro inviting you to join me Saturday, September 12th, for an apologetics workshop at Zion Lutheran Church in Mascoutah, Illinois. I'll be leading a seminar on the liturgical encounter. Other presentations include the theology and culture of worship and musical catechesis. Registration is only $20 and includes a light breakfast and lunch. Learn more about Worship as Apologetic Saturday, September 12th at zionmascoutah.org.